This content is the property of Dark Romance Stories. Please do not copy or re-upload it in any form. The rain over Manhattan came down in silver needles, and Sophia Marchetti stood beneath the awning of the Ritchie Tower with a leather folio pressed to her chest like armour. She had rehearsed this moment for 3 days, the handshake, the posture, the careful neutrality of her expression, because everyone who had ever worked for Marco Ricci warned her about the same thing. He watches you before he ever speaks to you. She had heard the name Ricci long before she'd seen the man. It was a name spoken in hushed tones at the consulate parties her mother used to drag her to. A name that made older men straighten their spines and younger men avert their eyes. Officially, Marco Ricci was a shipping and real estate magnate, the third generation of an empire that had grown out of the Sicilian coastline and taken root in New York like ivy on old stone. Unofficially, and this was the word everyone used, unofficially, his family had never stopped being what it was in 1962, when his grandfather stepped off a boat with nothing but a name and a knife. Sophia didn't care about any of that. She cared about the $22,000 the recruiter had promised for 6 weeks of work. Money that would clear her mother's hospital debt and leave enough over to finally breathe. She was fluent in 7 dialects of Italian, 3 of them nearly extinct, taught to her by a grandmother who refused to let the old tongue die with her. It was, Sophia had always believed, a useless, beautiful skill, until the recruiter called and said Marco Ricci needed someone who could translate not just modern Italian, but the old Calabrian spoken in the hill towns above Reggio, a dialect so regional that most native Italians couldn't pass it. The elevator to the 40th floor required a keycard and a retinal scan. A security guard the size of a refrigerator escorted her down a marble hallway lined with modern art that looked far too expensive to be real, and yet she suspected it was. "Wait here," he said, and left her standing before a pair of black lacquered doors. She waited 7 minutes. She counted them. When the doors finally opened, it wasn't an assistant who greeted her. It was him. Marco Ricci was taller than she expected, and colder. He wore a charcoal suit with no tie, the top button of his shirt undone, as if formality bored him, and he tolerated it only because the world demanded it. His hair was dark, threaded with the first silver of 40. Cut close at the sides. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath. Pale grey, almost colourless, the kind of eyes that made a room go quiet without him raising his voice. "You're the interpreter," he said, not a question. "Sophia Marchetti." She extended her hand. He looked at it for a beat too long before taking it, and his grip was neither gentle nor cruel, simply absolute, the grip of a man who had never once doubted his right to hold something as long as he wanted. "You speak Calabrese, the old dialect, not the tourist version." "I speak the version my grandmother spoke. She was born in Gerace, before the war." Something flickered behind his eyes, not warmth, not yet, but interest, the way a predator's gaze sharpens at unexpected movement. "Say something to me. In it." Sophia hesitated only a moment before switching languages, her voice dropping into the guttural, musical rhythm of the old dialect. "You're testing me the way my grandmother used to test priests who claimed to know Latin, to see if they were frauds before she trusted them with her sins." For the first time, something like amusement moved across his mouth. It wasn't a smile, it was the ghost of one, gone before it fully arrived. Good, he said, switching back to English, as though the door between languages had never opened. You start Monday. You'll be present for every meeting, every dinner, every phone call with my partners in Calabria. You do not leave my side during business hours. You do not repeat anything you hear outside these walls. Are we clear? Very. There's a contract. My lawyer will go over the terms. If you break confidentiality... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The silence did the threatening for him. Sophia lifted her chin. She had grown up around men who mistook silence for power, and she had learned long ago that showing fear only fed them. I understand exactly what I'm agreeing to, Mr. Ricci. I'm not interested in your secrets. I'm interested in being paid. That earned her a longer look, assessing, sharp, faintly surprised. Most people who walked through those doors trembled. She didn't. Monday, he said again, and turned, the doors closing behind him before she could say another word. Sophia stood alone in the hallway for a moment, her heart hammering despite every effort to keep it steady. She told herself it was nerves. She told herself it was nothing more than the natural response to meeting a dangerous man. She did not yet know that Marco Ricci had already made a decision standing in that doorway, one that would change the shape of both their lives. He had decided he wanted to know what she sounded like when she wasn't performing composure. 3 days later, she received an encrypted contract via courier, along with a black card and an address in Tribeca, the building where, she would soon learn, the entire east wing of the 40th floor served as Ricci's private penthouse, separated from the corporate offices by a single reinforced door that required his fingerprint alone. She hadn't asked why an interpreter needed access to his home. She would understand that answer soon enough, and by then it would already be too late to walk away. Monday came wrapped in tension Sophia hadn't anticipated. She arrived at 7 a.m. as instructed, dressed in the charcoal blazer she reserved for the most important interviews, only to be informed by Marco's assistant, a sharp-eyed woman named Renata, that her first assignment wouldn't begin until that evening. "Dinner," Renata said, handing her a garment bag. "Private residence. The Morettis are coming from Calabria, Don Alessio Moretti and his son, Enzo. You'll sit beside Mr. Ricci the entire evening. Translate everything, including what you're not meant to hear." "Excuse me?" Renata's mouth curved without warmth. "You'll understand tonight." The dress in the garment bag was midnight blue, simple, expensive in the way that avoided ostentation, the kind of dress meant to make a woman blend into a room of powerful men rather than distract from them. Sophia changed in a private suite on the 39th floor and studied herself in the mirror, trying to reconcile the woman staring back, poised, elegant, armoured in silk, with the 28-year-old who, until 3 weeks ago, had been translating insurance documents for a firm in Queens to pay her mother's chemotherapy bills. "This is just a job," she told herself. "A very well-paid, very strange job." The Ricci penthouse occupied the entire top floor of a converted warehouse in Tribeca. Glass walls overlooking the Hudson, a private elevator that opened directly into a foyer with black marble floors and a chandelier that looked like frozen lightning. Sophia had expected wealth. She hadn't expected this. The particular hush of old money mixed with new danger. The way even the flowers on the entry table seemed arranged with military precision. Marco was waiting in the study when she arrived, a glass of Barolo in his hand, watching the city through the window with the stillness of a man who trusted nothing he couldn't see coming. "You look—" He stopped himself, as though the word he'd almost used didn't belong in his mouth. "Appropriate," he finished instead. "High praise." The ghost's smile again. "Don Moretti doesn't speak English. His son speaks a little, but poorly, and he prefers to pretend he doesn't understand more than he does. It's a tactic. Watch his hands, not his mouth. He lies with his face. He tells the truth with his fingers." "You've studied him." "I study everyone." His pale eyes found hers, and there was something unsettling in the way he said it, as if he were including her in that statement, cataloguing her, even now. The Morettis arrived at 8, flanked by 2 men who didn't sit at the table but stood near the doors with the coiled patience of dogs waiting for a command. Don Alessio Moretti was 70, silver-haired, with the weathered face of a man who had spent decades in the sun of Calabria and the shadows of something far darker. His son Enzo was younger, handsome in a cruel way, his eyes lingering on Sophia a beat too long when he was introduced. Dinner began in a careful choreography of pleasantries: the wine, the weather, the health of family members long dead and long buried, all of it passing through Sophia's mouth in flawless translation, her voice shifting effortlessly between English and modern Italian. Then, midway through the second course, Don Moretti leaned toward his son and murmured something in the old Calabrian dialect, low and fast, clearly believing it unintelligible to anyone but family. "Watch the American. He wants the port contracts more than he's letting on. A hungry man makes mistakes. When he's desperate enough, we take more than the 12%. Sophia's spine went rigid. She glanced at Marco. He was watching Don Moretti's face with polite, unknowing patience, utterly unaware of what had just been said in front of him. Every instinct told her to translate faithfully, word for word, as her contract demanded. But something else, some instinct sharper than professionalism, made her hesitate half a second before she spoke. "Don Moretti compliments the wine," she said smoothly in English, "and mentions his son used to visit vineyards near here as a boy." It was a lie. A necessary one, she told herself, because the old man's threat had not been meant for Marco's ears, and translating it verbatim in that room, in front of the Don's own men, could have detonated the dinner into violence. But it was also the first time she understood, with a cold certainty, that she now possessed something dangerous, the ability to control what Marco Ricci knew. Later, near midnight, when the Morettis had gone and the staff had cleared the table, Marco poured 2 glasses of grappa and set one in front of her without asking if she wanted it. "You lied to me tonight," he said quietly. Her stomach dropped. "I don't deny it." I watched Alessio's mouth. He said more words than you translated. His grey eyes were unreadable, dangerous in their stillness. "Tell me what he actually said." Sophia's pulse hammered. She could lose everything in this moment, the money, the job, possibly worse if the rumours about the Ricci family's temperament held any truth. But she had already decided, somewhere in that split second at the table, that she would rather tell him the truth now than let a threat fester unspoken. "He said you want the port contracts more than you're admitting. He said hunger makes men careless. He said when you're desperate enough, they'll take more than the 12%. Marco was silent for a long moment. Then, to her shock, something like respect moved through his expression. "Why didn't you translate it as spoken?" "Because if I had, his own men would have heard it exposed at your table. And men like that don't forgive humiliation in front of witnesses. I protected the room. Not him, not you, the room. Marco studied her the way he might study a chessboard mid-game, recalculating, reassessing every piece. "You're not just an interpreter," he said finally. "No," Sophia admitted, meeting his eyes without flinching. "I don't think I am." The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm Sophia hadn't expected to find comforting. Mornings began at the Ritchie corporate offices, where she sat 2 seats behind Marco during board meetings that meant nothing to her. Shipping manifests, real estate acquisitions, numbers that painted the portrait of a legitimate empire, even as she caught, again and again, the seams where the legitimate business frayed into something else. She learnt to read the room the way Marco had told her to read Don Moretti. Watch the hands, not the mouth. She learnt which of his lieutenants flinched when certain names were mentioned. A man called Vitale, in particular, whose jaw tightened every time the words "the Calabrian shipment" were spoken, as though the phrase itself were a wound. She learnt, too, that Marco Ricci spoke to himself in the old dialect when he thought no one understood. It happened first on a Tuesday, in the back of his armoured Mercedes, driving from a meeting with city officials to a private club in Midtown. Marco stared out the tinted window, jaw tight, and murmured, so low she almost missed it, a sentence in Calabrian dialect meant for no ears at all. "I am so tired of being what my father made me." Sophia said nothing. She kept her eyes on her phone, pretending she hadn't heard, though the words settled into her chest like a stone dropped into still water. It was the first crack she'd seen in him, the first glimpse past the granite composure into something raw and human, something that ached. It happened again 2 days later, in his office, after a call with a man whose voice on speakerphone had been sharp with barely restrained anger. When the call ended, Marco sat very still for a long moment, hands flat on the desk, and murmured, again in the dialect, believing himself alone with his thoughts. "If I lose this, I lose everything my grandfather built, and they will finally see me as what I've always feared I was, not enough." Sophia stood by the window, ostensibly reviewing documents, and felt something shift inside her chest. She had been hired to translate his words for others. She had not expected to become the sole witness to the words he never meant for anyone to hear at all. That evening, as she gathered her things to leave, Marco looked up from his desk and studied her with unusual intensity. "You've been quiet today," he said. "I'm always quiet. It's the job." "No," he set down his pen. "There's a difference between professional silence and whatever this is. You've been watching me like you're deciding something." Sophia hesitated. She could lie again. She was becoming disturbingly good at it, but something about the rawness she'd overheard made lying feel like a betrayal rather than a mercy. "You talk to yourself," she said finally, "in the dialect. You don't realize anyone understands it." His entire body went still, the particular stillness of a predator that has just realized the ground beneath him isn't solid. "What have you heard?" "Enough to know you don't sleep well. Enough to know you're afraid of disappointing a man who's been dead for years, if the way you speak of your father is any indication. Enough to know that underneath all of this," she gestured vaguely at the office, the empire visible through the glass walls beyond it, "you don't actually believe you're enough. Which is absurd, by the way, considering what you've built. But I don't think you want my opinion on that." For a long, dangerous moment, Marco said nothing. His pale eyes had gone hard, unreadable, and Sophia wondered if she had finally overstepped in a way that couldn't be undone, if she'd see security at her door within the hour, escorting her out of the building and out of his life, with the contract's confidentiality clause weaponized against her. Instead, he rose slowly from his desk and crossed the room until he stood close enough that she could see the faint shadows beneath his eyes, evidence of the sleeplessness she'd just accused him of. "No one has heard me speak like that since my grandmother died," he said quietly. "I was careful. I've always been careful. I wasn't trying to catch you. I know." His voice had dropped, low and rough, entirely unlike the controlled cadence he used in boardrooms. "That's what frightens me." The air between them had changed, thickened, charged with something neither of them named. Sophia was suddenly aware of how close he stood, of the particular warmth radiating from him, despite the coldness that usually seemed to surround him like a second skin. "Mr. Ricci—" "Marco," he corrected, quiet and certain. "If you're going to know me better than anyone alive, you can at least use my name." She swallowed. "Marco. I signed a confidentiality contract. Whatever I hear stays with me. That includes what you say when you think you're alone." "I believe you." He studied her face with an intensity that made her skin warm. "That's the problem. I believe you completely. And I don't believe anyone completely. Not my brother, not my consigliere, no one." His jaw tightened. "You've been in this office 6 weeks, Sophia, and you already know more about what's inside my head than men who've worked for my family for 20 years. Maybe that's because I'm not trying to use it against you." Something shifted in his expression, a fracture, small but unmistakable, in the granite. "Everyone eventually tries to use something against me. It's the nature of the world I live in. I'm not everyone." He looked at her for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped to something almost tender, almost frightened by its own tenderness. "No," he murmured. "I'm beginning to understand that you're not." The Onyx Room occupied the basement of a converted bank on the Lower East Side, a club so exclusive it had no sign, no listed number, no presence beyond word of mouth among the city's wealthiest and most dangerous. Marco owned it, though officially the deed belonged to a shell corporation 3 layers removed from his name. Sophia learned this the way she learned most things about him now, through fragments, half-admissions, the things he let slip when he forgot to be careful around her. The occasion was a celebration. The port contracts, after weeks of negotiation, had finally closed in Marco's favour. Don Moretti's threat from that first dinner had never materialised into anything beyond words, or so it seemed, though Sophia had noticed Vitale's unease growing sharper in recent days, a tension she couldn't yet name. She hadn't planned to attend. Her role, technically, ended once the ink dried on contracts, but Marco had appeared at her desk that afternoon with an expression that brooked no argument. "Wear something you like," he'd said. "Tonight isn't business." The dress she chose was deep emerald, backless, the kind of dress she hadn't worn since before her mother's illness had swallowed every spare dollar and every reason to feel beautiful. When she stepped out of the car in front of the Onyx Room, Marco was waiting. And the look on his face, brief, involuntary, gone almost as soon as it appeared, told her everything she needed to know about how she looked. You clean up well, Mr. Ricci, she said, echoing his own dry tone back at him. Marco, he corrected again, offering his arm. And you're not cleaning up. You simply are this. Inside, the club pulsed with low red light and a bass line that seemed to live in the floor itself. Marco's men were scattered throughout, watchful even in celebration, and Sophia understood without being told that this wasn't a party so much as a performance, a display of power for the dozens of guests who owed Marco favours, feared his name, or hoped to earn a place in his circle. She stayed close to him, as instructed, translating small conversations with a handful of Italian guests, watching the room the way he'd taught her to watch rooms, hands, not mouths. It was near midnight when Enzo Moretti appeared. Sophia hadn't realised he was in New York. The port deal had been finalised without the Morettis present, their interests represented by lawyers instead. But there he was, moving through the crowd with the easy confidence of a man who'd never once been told no. And when his eyes found Sophia across the room, something predatory sharpened in his expression. "Sophia Marchetti," he said in Italian, sliding into the space beside her before she could retreat. "I remember you, the interpreter with the old tongue. Mr. Moretti. Enzo, please." His gaze travelled down the length of her dress, unhurried, proprietary. "You're wasted on translation work. A woman who looks like you, who speaks like you." He reached out, fingers brushing her bare arm. "There are better uses for such talents." Sophia stepped back, calm but firm. "I'm here in a professional capacity." "Everything is professional. Until it isn't." His hand moved again, closing around her wrist this time, not violent, but unmistakably possessive. She didn't see Marco cross the room. One moment Enzo's fingers were on her wrist, the next Marco's hand had closed around Enzo's forearm, with a grip that made the younger man's face go white. "You're touching something that isn't yours," Marco said, his voice low, almost pleasant, which somehow made it more terrifying than shouting would have. "Ricci." Enzo forced a laugh, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I was only being friendly with your interpreter." "She's not just my interpreter." Marco's pale eyes had gone glacial, and the club around them seemed to sense the shift in temperature. Conversations nearby faltered into silence. "And you'll remove your hand from her arm before I remove it from you." Enzo let go, stepping back with the forced casualness of a man trying to preserve his dignity in front of a room that had just watched him lose it. "Careful, Ricci. My father wouldn't appreciate hearing you threatened his son over a woman." "Tell your father," Marco said evenly, "that I don't make threats. I make promises. And I promise you, if you touch her again, in New York or in Calabria or anywhere on this earth, it will be the last thing your hands ever do." Enzo's jaw tightened, fury and humiliation warring in his expression. But something in Marco's stillness, the utter certainty of the threat, made him retreat instead of escalate. He melted back into the crowd, and the club's noise slowly resumed its normal register, though Sophia could feel eyes still lingering on them, cataloguing what had just happened, what it meant. Marco turned to her, and the fury in his eyes hadn't fully faded, though it had transformed into something else entirely, something rawer, more frightening in its intensity. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his hand hovering near her wrist without touching it, as though asking silent permission. "I'm fine." "Marco, that was necessary." His jaw was still tight. He doesn't get to touch you. No one does. I can defend myself. I know you can. His voice had dropped again, low and rough. That's not the point. Then what is? He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes tracing her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken, despite every instinct telling her this was dangerous ground. The point, he said finally, is that watching another man's hands on you made me want to break every bone in his body, and I have never in my life felt that particular urge over a woman I hadn't yet even kissed. The confession hung in the air between them, raw and unguarded in a way Sophia hadn't heard from him before, not even in the private murmurs she'd overheard in the dialect he thought no one understood. Marco, I know, he said before she could finish whatever protest she'd been forming. I know exactly how dangerous this is, for both of us. I've spent 6 weeks telling myself it's professional interest, admiration for your mind, nothing more. His gaze dropped briefly to her mouth before returning to her eyes. I'm done lying to myself about it. He didn't kiss her that night. Sophia would think about that restraint for days afterward. The fact that a man capable of shattering another man's composure with a single sentence, a man who owned half the shadows in 3 boroughs, had stood inches from her with desire naked in his eyes and chosen, deliberately, to step back. Not like this, he'd murmured, his thumb grazing her jaw so briefly she almost imagined it. Not in a club full of men who'll report every detail back to their own bosses. When I kiss you, Sophia, it will be because I want you to remember exactly what it felt like, with nothing else in the room to distract you from it. The words had followed her home, replayed themselves as she lay awake in her small apartment in Astoria, the city humming outside her window, while she tried to reconcile the danger of what she was feeling with the impossibility of stopping it. She told herself it was foolish. Marco Ricci was, by every rational measure, exactly the kind of man her mother had warned her about. Powerful, controlled, capable of violence that lived just beneath his tailored suits like a blade sheathed in silk. She had grown up watching men like him orbit her mother's old social circles, had watched women disappear into marriages that looked like gilded cages from the outside and felt like something far worse within. And yet, there was something in the way Marco looked at her that made all of that rational fear feel distant, theoretical. He looked at her the way she imagined a starving man might look at the first meal in weeks. Not with the casual hunger of someone who could simply take what he wanted, but with something closer to reverence, as though he were afraid that looking too hard, wanting too much, might make her disappear. The following Monday, she arrived at the office to find her workspace had changed. The small desk in the corner where she usually sat had been replaced by an office adjacent to Marco's own, connected by a private door instead of a hallway. Fresh flowers sat on the desk, not roses, she noted, but sprigs of rosemary and wild mint, the same herbs her grandmother used to grow in coffee cans on a Queen's fire escape. "How did you know?" she asked, when Marco appeared in the doorway between their offices. "Know what?" "The mint, the rosemary. My grandmother used to—" She stopped, startled by her own vulnerability. "I asked Renata to find out what would remind you of home." His expression was carefully neutral, but there was something almost shy beneath it, an uncertainty that looked strange on a face built for command. Was it wrong? No. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. It's perfect. Thank you. He nodded once, as though the matter were closed, though the softness in his eyes lingered a moment longer than necessary before he retreated back into his own office, leaving the connecting door open, a small, deliberate signal that the wall between them had shifted. It was 3 days later that Vitale, Marco's second-in-command, cornered Sophia near the elevator bank, his expression grim. "A word," he said, glancing around before drawing her into an empty conference room. "Mr. Vitale? You should be careful," he said without preamble, his voice low and urgent. "Whatever's happening between you and Marco, I see it. Everyone sees it. It's not safe. Not for you." "I'm not sure that's your business." "It's exactly my business." His jaw tightened. "I've worked for this family for 22 years. I watched his father, God rest him, use women the way other men use cigarettes, lit up, enjoyed, discarded. I don't think Marco is his father. But the world he lives in doesn't care what kind of man he wants to be. It only cares what kind of man his enemies believe him to be. And a woman who matters to him is a weapon they'll use, one way or another." Sophia's stomach tightened. "Is that a warning or a threat?" "A warning." Vitale's eyes were serious, almost pleading. "The Morettis aren't the only ones circling this deal. There are people in Calabria, old enemies of Marco's grandfather, who would very much like to see this port contract collapse, and Marco along with it. If they learn there's a woman who's gotten past every wall he's ever built, they won't hesitate to use that." "Why are you telling me this?" Vitale studied her for a long moment, something almost sad in his expression. "Because I think you actually care about him, and because someone should have warned me 20 years ago before I learned the hard way what loving someone in this family costs." He left before she could ask what he meant by that, whether he spoke of himself, of someone he'd lost, of a wound that had never quite healed. She stood alone in the conference room for a long time afterward, Vitale's warnings settling into her chest, alongside everything else she was beginning to feel for Marco Ricci: desire, fear, and the growing, undeniable certainty that she was already in far too deep to walk away cleanly. That evening, Marco found her still at her desk, long after the office had emptied, staring at nothing, lost in thought. "You're upset," he said, leaning against the doorframe between their offices. "Vitale spoke to me today." Something flickered across Marco's face. Not surprise, she noted, but a kind of resigned understanding, as though he'd expected this conversation eventually. "What did he tell you?" "That caring about you is dangerous. That your enemies would use me against you if they knew what I meant to you." Marco crossed the room slowly, stopping close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. "He's not wrong. That's not exactly reassuring. I'm not interested in reassuring you with lies." His voice had dropped low, rough at the edges. "I'm interested in telling you the truth, which is this. The world I live in is dangerous, Sophia. It doesn't care about the things it takes from good people. If you stay, if this becomes what I think it's becoming, there will be risk, real risk, not the theoretical kind. And if I decide the risk is worth it?" His hand rose finally to cup her jaw, thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with a tenderness that contradicted everything about the danger he'd just described. "Then I will spend every resource I have, every man, every dollar, every ounce of power my grandfather built, making sure nothing and no one ever touches you." His gaze burned into hers, fierce and absolute. You would become the single most protected woman in this city, Sophia, because I don't share what's mine, and I don't lose what I've claimed. The word claimed should have frightened her. Instead, it settled into her chest like something she'd been waiting to hear her entire life. And when he finally lowered his mouth to hers, slow and deliberate, tasting of grappa and restraint finally broken, Sophia understood that whatever warning Vitale had given her, it was already, hopelessly, too late. The kiss changed everything and nothing. In the days that followed, Marco remained precisely as controlled in the boardroom, as ruthless in negotiations, as unreadable to everyone except her. But in the quiet moments between meetings, in the back of the Mercedes, in the private elevator, in the hour before dawn, when he sometimes called her simply to hear her voice, he let something show that Sophia suspected no one else alive had ever been permitted to see. He told her about his father one night, in the study of the Tribeca penthouse, a bottle of Barolo between them and the city glittering silent beyond the windows. "My father believed love was a liability," Marco said, staring into his glass rather than at her. "He told me once, when I was maybe 12, that a man in our position could afford enemies, could afford rivals, could even afford to lose money. What he couldn't afford was to let anyone matter enough to be used against him. He said, the day I loved someone was the day I handed my enemies a knife. That's a bleak way to raise a child." It was an effective one. His jaw tightened. "I never let anyone close. Not really. Not until—" He stopped himself, but the sentence didn't need finishing. His pale eyes finally found hers, and there was something almost frightened in them, an emotion so foreign to his usual composure that it made her chest ache. "I don't know how to do this, Sophia. I know how to run an empire. I know how to make grown men flinch with a single sentence. I don't know how to—" His hand gestured vaguely, helplessly, between them. "You're doing fine," she said softly. "Am I?" His laugh was humorless. "I had Vitale run a full background check on you within the first week. I've had a man watching your apartment building since our second dinner, not because I don't trust you, but because I couldn't bear the thought of something happening to you that I hadn't anticipated. I think about you when I should be thinking about contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I am, by every definition my father ever gave me, already exactly the fool he warned me never to become." Sophia set down her glass and moved to sit beside him, closer than professional distance would ever allow, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him. "Maybe your father was wrong. My father built an empire that's lasted 3 generations. And was he happy?" Marco was quiet for a long moment. He died alone in a hospital bed, having outlived 2 wives who left him and a son who visited out of obligation rather than love. So no, I don't think he was happy. I think he was powerful, which he mistook for the same thing. And what do you mistake power for? The question seemed to catch him off guard. He turned to look at her fully, something raw and unguarded moving across his face. "I used to think they were the same thing too. Power and purpose, power and meaning." His hand found hers, lacing their fingers together with a gentleness that felt disproportionate to a man capable of the violence she knew simmered beneath his surface. Then you walked into my office, speaking a dead dialect like it was still alive in your mouth, and I realized I'd been mistaking a great many things for a great many years. She leaned into him then, and he wrapped an arm around her, and for a long while neither of them spoke, content simply to sit in the quiet, the city humming distantly beyond the glass, two people who had both, in their own ways, been taught that closeness was a liability, discovering together that it might instead be the only thing worth the risk. It was nearly midnight when Marco's phone rang, shattering the fragile peace. Sophia watched his face shift instantly back into the controlled mask of the man who ran an empire, watched warmth retreat behind granite as he answered in clipped Italian. She caught fragments, a name she didn't recognize, the word shipment, the word compromised, before Marco rose abruptly, crossing to the window, his back rigid with tension. When he ended the call, he stood silent for a long moment before turning to face her, and the expression on his face made her stomach drop. What happened? One of my shipments, legitimate cargo, textiles, nothing that should have drawn attention, was seized at the port in Naples 3 hours ago. Italian customs acting on what they're calling a credible tip. His jaw was tight, his eyes calculating with a coldness that reminded her, uncomfortably, of the man she'd first met in that hallway weeks ago. Someone tipped them off, Sophia. Someone who knew exactly which shipment to target, on exactly which day, to cause maximum damage to the Moretti deal. You think it's Moretti? Retaliation for what happened at the club? Maybe. Marco's eyes had gone distant, calculating. Or maybe it's someone closer. Someone who wants this deal to collapse and wants me distracted enough not to notice who's really pulling the strings. Sophia felt a chill move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. Marco, what if it's someone inside your own organization? He didn't answer immediately, and the silence that stretched between them felt heavier than any words could have. When he finally spoke, his voice had dropped to something low and dangerous, the voice she imagined he used with men who had crossed him beyond forgiveness. "Then I will find them," he said, "and they will regret ever believing they could move against me without consequence." Sophia watched him in that moment, the tenderness of an hour ago replaced entirely by something colder, harder, a man capable of violence she hadn't yet witnessed but could suddenly, viscerally imagine, and understood, with a clarity that frightened her, exactly how dangerous the world she'd fallen into truly was. The days that followed the seizure in Naples transformed the atmosphere of Ritchie Tower into something taut and watchful. Marco called an emergency meeting of his inner circle. Vitale, his younger brother Dante, a lawyer named Cross who handled matters too delicate for ordinary counsel, and, to the visible surprise of everyone in the room, Sophia. "She stays," Marco said flatly, when Dante's eyebrows rose at her presence. "She hears everything I hear. That's not changing." Dante Ritchie was younger than Marco by 6 years, with the same dark hair but none of his brother's stillness. Restless energy simmered beneath his expensive suit, and his eyes, when they landed on Sophia, carried a wariness that bordered on hostility. "With respect, brother, she's an interpreter. This is family business." "She stays," Marco repeated, in a tone that closed the subject permanently. The meeting that followed painted a portrait grimmer than Sophia had anticipated. The Naples seizure wasn't an isolated incident. 2 smaller shipments had also been flagged in the past month, each one carrying nothing illegal, but each one strategically damaging enough to cast doubt on Ritchie Shipping's reliability with the Moretti family, who depended on those same ports for their own operations. "Someone's building a pattern," Vitale said grimly, spreading photographs and shipping manifests across the table, making it look like carelessness, making the Morettis question whether this partnership is worth the risk. "Or making it look like Marco can't be trusted to run his own operation," Dante added, his eyes flicking briefly, pointedly, towards Sophia. Which raises the question of who else has had unusual access to shipping schedules recently. The insinuation hung in the air, ugly and unmistakable. Sophia felt heat rise in her chest, not embarrassment, but fury. "If you're suggesting I had anything to do with this, I'm suggesting," Dante said coolly, "that 6 weeks ago no one outside this family had access to our internal schedules. Now an interpreter my brother met at a job interview sits in on every meeting, hears every detail, and shortly afterward someone with intimate knowledge of our shipping patterns starts feeding information to Italian customs." "That's enough." Marco's voice cracked through the room like a whip, and the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Sophia has been under my direct observation every hour of every day since she started. If you have evidence, Dante, present it. If you don't, you will never accuse her again in my presence." Dante held his brother's gaze for a long, tense moment before looking away first, jaw tight with something that looked like resentment layered over genuine fear. "I'm only trying to protect this family. Then find the actual leak," Marco said coldly, "instead of wasting time attacking the one person in this room who's never given me a reason to doubt her." The meeting dissolved shortly after, the room clearing out in uneasy silence. Sophia lingered, gathering her notes with hands that trembled slightly from adrenaline, when Vitale approached, his expression troubled. "Dante's not entirely wrong to be cautious," he said quietly. "Not about you specifically, but about the timing. Whoever's doing this either has access inside this building or access to someone inside it. That's not paranoia. That's math. You don't think it's me?" "No." Vitale's voice was gentle, almost apologetic. "I ran your background myself, remember? Your mother's medical bills, your grandmother's death. Your entire life is a paper trail of struggle, not conspiracy. Whoever's doing this has resources you don't have and motives you've never shown. But I'd be lying if I said there wasn't someone in this building I've started watching more carefully." "Who?" Vitale glanced toward the door, lowering his voice further. "I'll tell you when I'm certain. Until then, watch your own back, Sophia. Whoever's doing this is smart enough to have gotten this far without detection. That means they're smart enough to notice if someone starts closing in." That night, Marco found her in her office, long after the building had emptied, staring at shipping manifests she had no real authority to review, but had begun studying anyway, driven by a need to understand, to help, to prove herself useful in a war she'd unwittingly become part of. "You should go home," he said softly, appearing in the doorway. "I keep thinking about what Dante said. Ignore my brother. He's suspicious of everyone. It's why he's still alive in this business." Marco crossed the room and sat on the edge of her desk, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something dark and expensive that she'd come to associate entirely with him. "I don't doubt you, Sophia, not for a second. But someone is leaking information, someone close to you." His jaw tightened. "Yes. And if it's someone you trust, then I'll deal with it the way I deal with every betrayal." His voice had gone flat, cold, and for a moment Sophia glimpsed the version of him that existed beneath the tailored suits and careful restraint, the version his enemies feared, the version capable of the violence his empire had been built upon. Completely, without hesitation, without mercy. The words should have frightened her more than they did. Instead, sitting there in the dim glow of her desk lamp, watching the coldness in his eyes soften the moment they returned to her face, Sophia understood something she hadn't fully grasped until that moment. She wasn't just falling for a dangerous man. She was falling for a man who would burn his own family to the ground to protect her. And the terrifying part wasn't the violence he was capable of. It was how safe, despite everything, she felt beside him. The gala at the Calvano Museum was, on paper, a charity event, a black-tie fundraiser for restoration of Renaissance art, attended by the kind of old-money families who wouldn't dream of acknowledging where half the donated wealth in the room had actually originated. In practice, it was another performance, another stage where Marco needed to appear untouchable in front of investors, politicians, and the watchful eyes of men who might report back to the Morettis on whether Ritchie Shipping's troubles were affecting its reputation. Sophia wore crimson that night, a deliberate choice Marco had made for her, sliding the dress box across his desk that afternoon with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to dressing the women in his life exactly as he wished the world to see them. Red, she'd noted, arching an eyebrow. Subtle. I want every man in that room to understand exactly whose attention they'd be risking if they looked at you too long. That's absurdly possessive. Yes, he'd agreed, without a trace of apology. The gala unfolded exactly as such events did. Champagne, string quartets, the particular hum of powerful people performing civility for each other. Sophia stayed close to Marco's side, translating when needed, watching the room the way he'd taught her, until a voice cut through the crowd that made her blood run cold. Sophia Marchetti. What an unexpected pleasure. She turned to find Enzo Moretti approaching, resplendent in a tailored tuxedo, his expression carrying the particular confidence of a man who believed the humiliation at the Onyx Room had been a temporary setback rather than a permanent lesson. "Mr. Moretti," she said evenly, "I didn't realize you were in New York." "I wasn't. Business brought me back early." His eyes travelled over her crimson dress with open appreciation. "It seems fate wanted us to meet again." "Enzo." Marco's voice arrived a beat later than Sophia would have liked, low and dangerous, his hand settling possessively at the small of her back. "I don't recall inviting you." "It's a public gala, Ricci. Anyone with money can buy a ticket." Enzo's smile was all teeth, no warmth. "Though I imagine you'd prefer I stayed in Calabria, given how protective you've become of your interpreter." "She's more than my interpreter, and you know it." "Do I?" Enzo's gaze slid to Sophia, something calculating beneath the charm. "My father's been asking questions, you know, about the American who's grown distracted lately, about the port seizures that started right around the same time he acquired a beautiful new employee with unusual access to his private life." Sophia felt Marco's hand tense against her back, the barely restrained fury radiating off him like heat. "If you're suggesting—" "I'm suggesting nothing." Enzo raised his hands in mock surrender, though the satisfaction in his eyes told a different story. "I'm simply making conversation. Though I do wonder, Ritchie, whether you've considered that a woman with access to everything you know, everything you say, everything you plan, a woman my father's people could very easily approach with an offer more generous than whatever you're paying her, might not be quite as loyal as you'd like to believe. The suggestion hung in the air, poisonous and deliberate, and Sophia understood with sudden clarity exactly what Enzo was doing, planting a seed of doubt, not for her sake, but for the pleasure of watching it potentially unravel something Marco clearly valued. "Get out of my sight," Marco said, his voice dropping to something almost inhumanly calm, which somehow made it more terrifying than shouting would have. "Before I forget, we're standing in a room full of witnesses." Enzo's smile widened, satisfied at having landed his blow, and he retreated into the crowd with the unhurried confidence of a man who'd accomplished exactly what he came to do. Sophia turned to Marco, expecting to find fury directed at Enzo's departing back. Instead, she found something worse, a flicker of doubt, quickly suppressed but unmistakably present in his pale eyes. "You don't actually believe him," she said quietly. "No." Marco's jaw was tight, "but he's right that it would be easy. If someone offered you enough money to disappear, to feed information to my enemies, you'd have every opportunity." "Marco." Her voice was sharp now, hurt cutting through the careful composure she'd maintained all evening. "After everything, after every moment you've spent trusting me with things you've told no one else, you're going to let Enzo Moretti plant doubt with a single conversation?" "I'm not doubting you." His hand found her face, tilting it up toward him with a gentleness that contradicted the tension still radiating from his shoulders. "I'm terrified of losing you. There's a difference, even if it doesn't feel like one right now." "It doesn't." "I know." He exhaled slowly, some of the tension leaving his frame. "I've spent my entire life building walls specifically so no one could ever get close enough to hurt me the way losing you would hurt me. And now the walls are gone, and every instinct I have is screaming that this level of vulnerability is a mistake, even though every other instinct I have is telling me you're the only true thing in my entire life." Sophia softened despite herself, despite the sting of his momentary doubt. "I'm not going anywhere, Marco. Not for money. Not for anything the Morettis could offer." "I believe you." He pressed a kiss to her forehead, lingering there in a rare public display of tenderness. "But I'm going to have Vitale increase security around you regardless. Enzo doesn't make idle conversation. If he's suggesting the Morettis might approach you, it's because they're already considering it." The rest of the gala passed in a haze of careful diplomacy, but Sophia couldn't shake the unease Enzo's words had planted. Not doubt about her own loyalty, but a growing dread about how far the Morettis, or whoever was truly behind the shipping sabotage, might be willing to go to fracture whatever was growing between her and Marco. She didn't yet know how prophetic that dread would prove to be. The threat arrived 3 days later, tucked inside a bouquet of black roses, delivered to Sophia's apartment with no card, no return address, nothing but the flowers themselves and a single photograph slipped between the stems. The photograph showed Sophia leaving her building that morning, taken from across the street with a telephoto lens, time-stamped in the corner. On the back, in careful handwriting, a message in Italian. "Beautiful women should be careful which men they choose to protect. Not every protection lasts." Her hands shook as she called Marco, and within 20 minutes his car had arrived, Vitale and 2 additional security men flanking him as he took the stairs 2 at a time to reach her floor. "Show me," he said, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. She handed him the photograph and the note. Marco's expression as he read it transformed into something Sophia hadn't seen before. Not the cold calculation of the boardroom, not the tender vulnerability of their private moments, but something primal and terrifying, the face of a man who had just been shown proof that someone intended to hurt what belonged to him. "Vitali," he said, his voice deadly quiet. "I want to know who took this photograph within the hour. I want every camera on this block pulled. I want to know who's been watching her apartment." On it, Vitale was already moving, phone pressed to his ear, barking orders to men Sophia had never met. Marco turned to her, and the fury in his eyes softened into something almost desperate as he pulled her into his arms, holding her with a fierceness that spoke louder than any words could have. "You're not staying here tonight," he said against her hair. "You're not staying here at all, not until we find out who did this." "Marco, I have a life, an apartment. I can't just—" "You can, and you will." He pulled back to look at her, his hands framing her face with a desperation that made her chest ache. "I have spent my entire life protecting the people and things that matter to me, Sophia, and I have never once failed to do it. I am not starting now, not with you. Not when someone has just shown me they know where you sleep." She wanted to argue, some part of her rebelling against the idea of being managed, protected, relocated like a piece on his chessboard, rather than a person with agency of her own. But the fear in his eyes, genuine, raw fear, the kind she suspected he'd rarely, if ever, allowed himself to feel, silenced whatever protest she might have made. "Okay," she said quietly. "Okay." Within the hour, her belongings had been packed into 2 suitcases by security personnel with the efficiency of men accustomed to sudden relocations, and Sophia found herself in the passenger seat of Marco's armoured Mercedes, watching her old life recede in the side mirror as they drove toward Tribeca. The penthouse felt different that night, less like a fortress of luxury and more like an actual sanctuary, its reinforced walls and biometric security suddenly comforting rather than merely impressive. Marco set her up in a guest suite adjacent to his own bedroom, though it became clear within the first hour that neither of them had any intention of sleeping separately, not that night, not with fear still humming beneath both their skins. "Talk to me," Marco said, once they were finally settled on the sofa in his private study, a fire crackling in the hearth despite the mild autumn evening. A comfort, Sophia realized, rather than a necessity. "Tell me you're not regretting any of this." "I'm not." She meant it, despite the fear still coiled in her chest. "But I'd be lying if I said I wasn't scared." "You should be scared. I'm scared." The admission seemed to cost him something, a crack in the composure he wore like armor. "I've built enemies my whole life without truly fearing them, because I never had anything they could take from me that would actually break me. Now I do. Now there's you, and every enemy I've ever made suddenly has a weapon they didn't have before." "Do you know who sent it?" "Not yet. Could be the Morettis, testing whether Enzo's insinuations at the gala were true, whether threatening you would actually rattle me enough to make mistakes. Could be whoever's been leaking information about my shipments, trying to isolate me, distract me, make me vulnerable." His jaw tightened. "Could be someone closer than either of those possibilities, which is the thought that keeps me awake at night." "Dante?" Marco was silent for a long moment, and the silence told her more than words could have. "I don't want to believe it," He's my brother, but he's also the only person besides Vitale who's had consistent access to shipping schedules, who resents how much trust I've placed in you, who's made his suspicion of you clear from the moment you walked into that meeting. What are you going to do? Watch him, Marco said grimly. Watch everyone. And keep you close enough that no one, family or enemy, ever gets the chance to test how far they can go before I destroy them completely. That night, for the first time, Sophia slept in Marco's bed. Not out of passion, though the desire between them had only deepened with each passing week, but out of a need for proximity, for the simple comfort of his arms around her while the city's dangers circled closer than either of them wanted to admit. She woke twice in the night to find him awake beside her, staring at the ceiling with the particular tension of a man calculating threats even in the darkness. And both times he pulled her closer without a word, as though the simple fact of her presence was the only thing keeping his fear at bay. The investigation into the photographer moved quickly under Vitali's direction, and within 4 days they had a name. A freelance surveillance contractor named Bruno Salvi, based out of Brooklyn, with a history of taking discreet jobs for clients who preferred to remain anonymous. Marco and Vitale found him in a bar near Sunset Park, and whatever conversation transpired in the back office that evening was never fully relayed to Sophia, though Marco returned to the penthouse afterward with bruised knuckles and a grim, satisfied expression that told her everything she needed to know about how thoroughly the truth had been extracted. He was hired through an intermediary, Marco said, sitting across from her at the kitchen island, an ice pack pressed against his hand, while Sophia cleaned a small cut above his eyebrow with more tenderness than the moment probably warranted. Paid in cash, no direct contact with whoever ultimately wanted the photographs, but the intermediary, a man named Costa, has worked before for one client in particular. Who? Marco's expression darkened. Dante. The word landed like a stone dropped into still water, rippling outward into a silence neither of them seemed eager to fill. You're certain? Salvi gave up the name without much persuasion once he understood the alternative. Marco's jaw tightened, something raw and wounded moving beneath the fury in his eyes. My own brother hired someone to photograph you, to threaten you, presumably to scare you away from me, or to create exactly the kind of crisis that would force me to choose between protecting you and running this family with a clear head. Why would he do that? Because he's wanted more control over this business since our father died, and he's smart enough to know that a distracted, emotionally compromised leader is easier to manipulate than a focused one. Marco's hands curled into fists on the counter. I don't yet know if he's also behind the shipping leaks, but given everything, I'd be a fool to assume he isn't. Sophia felt sick, the fragile sense of safety she'd begun to build in the penthouse crumbling under the weight of this new betrayal, not from an external enemy, but from Marco's own blood. What are you going to do? Confront him. Marco's voice had gone flat, cold, terrifyingly calm. Tonight. The confrontation took place in Marco's study an hour later. Dante summoned under the pretense of discussing quarterly shipping numbers, walking into a room where Vitali stood by the door and Marco waited behind his desk with an expression carved from granite. Sit down, Marco said when Dante entered. What's this about? Bruno Salvi. Marco watched his brother's face with the focused intensity of a predator studying prey, and Sophia, seated in the corner, saw the flicker of recognition cross Dante's expression before he could suppress it. a flicker that confirmed everything Marco had suspected. Costa gave you up, Dante. Don't waste my time denying it. Dante's composure cracked, fury and fear warring across his face. You want to know why? Fine, I'll tell you why. Because you've become a liability, Marco. Ever since she walked through those doors, his eyes cut towards Sophia with venom, you've been distracted, careless, making decisions with your emotions instead of your mind. This family has survived 3 generations because the men who ran it understood that sentiment gets you killed. And you're out here falling in love with an interpreter while our shipments get seized and our partners start questioning whether the Ricci name still means what it used to. So your solution was to threaten her. Marco's voice had dropped to something dangerously quiet. To hire a man to photograph her outside her home, to send her a message clearly designed to frighten her away from me. My solution, Dante snapped, was to remind you what's actually at stake before your infatuation cost this family everything our grandfather built. I never intended to hurt her. I intended to scare her into leaving before she got both of you killed. And the shipping leaks? The Naples seizure? Was that you too, trying to manufacture a crisis you could then use to convince the family I'd lost control? Dante's silence was answer enough. Marco rose slowly from his desk, and the fury radiating off him was something Sophia had never witnessed before. Not the controlled coldness of their earlier confrontations, but something volcanic, barely restrained. You sabotaged this family's business. You endangered a deal worth hundreds of millions of dollars. You threatened a woman who has done nothing but prove herself trustworthy at every turn, all because you couldn't stomach watching me be happy. Marco's voice shook with the effort of restraint. You are my brother, Dante, my blood, and you did all of this. I did it to protect this family from your weakness. The word weakness seemed to detonate something in Marco. He crossed the room in 3 strides, and for a moment Sophia feared he might actually strike his own brother. But instead he stopped inches away, his voice dropping to a register more frightening than any shout could have been. Love is not weakness, Dante. It's the only thing that's made me question whether the life our father built for us is actually worth living. And you've just proven beyond any doubt that you're not fit to inherit any part of what I've built, because you don't understand the difference between strength and cruelty. He stepped back, his expression settling into something cold and final. You're finished here. Effective immediately. You'll have a monthly allowance sufficient to live comfortably, and you'll never set foot in this building, this family's business, or anywhere near Sophia again. If you violate any part of that, I will not be as merciful as I'm being tonight. You're exiling your own brother over a woman you've known for 2 months. I'm exiling my own brother, Marco said, his voice absolutely level now, because he endangered someone I love, sabotaged a business our grandfather built from nothing, and showed me exactly how little our blood means to him when it conflicts with his ambition. This isn't about Sophia, Dante. This is about you proving you can't be trusted with power, which is the only thing that has ever mattered in this family. Vitale escorted Dante from the building that night, and Sophia watched Marco stand at the window long afterward, staring out at the city with an expression of profound, exhausted grief, the particular sorrow of a man who had just severed a piece of himself, even knowing it was necessary. "Are you all right?" she asked softly, moving to stand beside him. "No," Marco admitted, his voice rough. "But I will be. Some losses are necessary, even when they hurt." He turned to look at her, something fierce and certain moving through his exhaustion. "I don't regret it, Sophia. I would exile every person in my life who threatened you, without hesitation, and I would do it again tomorrow if I had to." With Dante gone, the leaks stopped, and the port shipments that had been plagued by seizures and delays for weeks began moving smoothly once more. The Moretti deal, which had teetered on the edge of collapse throughout the crisis, stabilized as Don Alessio's suspicions eased, satisfied by Marco's swift and decisive handling of what he was told, in careful and diplomatic terms, was an internal family matter. For the first time since Sophia had begun working for Marco, something resembling peace settled over the penthouse. They fell into a rhythm that felt, despite everything, almost domestic. Mornings spent reviewing the day's schedule over espresso on the terrace, evenings spent tangled together on the study sofa, Marco reading contracts, while Sophia lost herself in novels she hadn't had time for in years. It was during one of these quiet evenings that Marco finally told her about his mother. "She left when I was 9, he said, staring into the fire rather than at her, his voice carrying a vulnerability Sophia had come to recognize as the precursor to his rarest confessions. "My father's business, the parts of it that weren't legitimate, finally became too much for her. She said she couldn't raise children in a house where she never knew if the men who came to dinner would be alive by morning." "Do you blame her for leaving?" "I used to." His jaw tightened. "I spent years hating her for choosing her own peace over her children. But I understand it better now, I think. Watching what this life does to people. Watching what it almost did to Dante. Watching what it could still do to us." His eyes found hers, fierce with an emotion that looked disturbingly close to desperation. "I don't want that for you, Sophia. I don't want you to become someone who has to choose between loving me and surviving." "I chose already," Sophia said quietly. "The night Enzo Moretti tried to insinuate himself between us. The night the black roses arrived. The night your own brother's betrayal came to light. I could have left after any of those moments. I stayed because I love you, Marco. Not despite the danger, but because I trust that you'll never stop fighting to make sure that danger never actually reaches me." Something in his expression broke open at her words, not the careful cracks she'd grown accustomed to, but a full, unguarded vulnerability that transformed his entire face. "Say it again," he murmured. "I love you." He kissed her then, with a desperation that spoke of every fear he'd carried since childhood, every wall he'd built and finally allowed to crumble. And when he finally pulled back, his forehead resting against hers, his voice was raw with an emotion she'd never heard from him before. "I have loved exactly 2 things in my life, without reservation," he said. "The empire my grandfather built, and now you. And I would burn the first one to the ground before I let anything happen to the second." That night, for the first time, they made love. Slow, unhurried, a reverence in every touch that spoke of 2 people who had both spent years believing themselves incapable of this particular kind of vulnerability. Afterward, tangled together in the vast bed overlooking the glittering city, Marco traced idle patterns against her bare shoulder, his voice soft in the darkness. "I want to take you to Calabria," he said, "to Gerace, where your grandmother was born. I want to see the hill towns that gave you that beautiful, dying language. I want to understand every part of where you come from, the way you've come to understand every part of me. That sounds like a proposal of sorts. Maybe it is. His hand found hers in the darkness, lacing their fingers together with quiet certainty. I've never wanted permanence with anyone before, Sophia. I've never wanted anyone to see the parts of me my father spent a lifetime teaching me to hide. But with you, I want all of it. The danger, the exposure, the terrifying vulnerability of loving someone the world could use against me. I want it because the alternative, a life without you in it, no longer feels like survival. It feels like the actual danger. She fell asleep that night, more content than she'd felt in years, wrapped in his arms, believing, perhaps foolishly, that the worst of the danger had passed, that Dante's exile had removed the threat, that the black roses had been a singular, isolated warning rather than the opening move of something far larger. She would soon learn how wrong that belief had been. The trip to Calabria took shape 3 weeks later, timed to coincide with a formal signing ceremony finalizing the port contracts at the Moretti family's ancestral estate outside Reggio. Marco had insisted Sophia accompany him, not merely as his interpreter, but publicly, for the first time, as the woman he intended to marry. A declaration that sent ripples through both families' circles long before they ever boarded the plane. Gerasi, when they finally visited the hill town where Sophia's grandmother had been born, took her breath away in a way she hadn't anticipated. The medieval streets wound upward through golden stone buildings, overlooking a valley that stretched toward a distant, glittering sea, and everywhere she walked, she heard echoes of the dialect her grandmother had spoken in a queen's kitchen, decades removed from these ancient hills. "It's exactly as she described it," Sophia murmured, standing before the town's ancient cathedral, tears gathering unexpectedly in her eyes. "She used to tell me stories about this place like it was a fairy tale. I never thought I'd actually see it." Marco's arm slid around her waist, his lips pressing gently against her temple. "Now you don't have to imagine it anymore." They spent 3 days in Geras before the formal business at the Moretti estate demanded their attention. 3 days of Marco watching Sophia move through the town with a lightness he'd rarely seen in her. 3 days of long dinners where she translated stories from elderly residents who remembered her grandmother's family. 3 days that felt, despite everything, like the closest thing to an ordinary courtship either of them had ever been permitted to experience. The Moretti estate, when they finally arrived for the signing ceremony, sprawled across a hillside overlooking the Ionian Sea, its ancient stone walls a testament to centuries of power that had shifted hands, sometimes peacefully, more often through violence, since long before either family's American branches had ever existed. Don Alessio greeted them with the careful warmth of a man who valued the deal too much to let personal grievances interfere, though his eyes lingered on Sophia with an assessing quality that made her uneasy. "The interpreter who became more than an interpreter," he said in the old dialect, testing her, the way he'd tested her at that first dinner months ago. "My son tells me you're a formidable woman, Signorina Marchetti." "Your son and I have had our disagreements," Sophia replied evenly in the same dialect, "but I hope tonight's signing puts old tensions to rest." Don Alessio's mouth curved, something like approval flickering behind his weathered eyes. "A diplomat as well as an interpreter. Marco Ricci, you've chosen well." He turned to Marco, switching to modern Italian for his benefit. "Shall we finish what our families started 3 generations ago?" The signing ceremony itself unfolded with the particular formality of old-world business. A long table, aged documents, a priest present to bless the agreement in a tradition that predated any of the men signing it. Sophia stood at Marco's side throughout, translating the final clauses, watching as ink finally sealed a partnership that had nearly collapsed under the weight of sabotage and suspicion months earlier. It was during the celebratory dinner that followed, the wine flowing freely and the tension of months finally beginning to unwind, that Enzo Moretti approached Sophia in a quiet corner of the terrace, his expression, for once, devoid of its usual predatory charm. "I owe you an apology," he said, in careful English, "for the club, for the gala. I behaved poorly, and I understand now that my actions nearly cost you both a great deal." "That's unexpected. My father made it clear that my behaviour reflected badly on this family during a delicate negotiation." Enzo's smile was rueful, self-aware in a way she hadn't seen from him before. "And, if I'm honest, watching how thoroughly Richie dismantled his own brother for endangering you made me realise the depth of what I was mocking. I've never seen a man protect something so completely. It made me ashamed of how casually I'd tried to test that protection." "Apology accepted," Sophia said, though something in his tone made her uneasy, a formality that felt rehearsed rather than genuine. "There's something else." Enzo glanced around, lowering his voice. "I probably shouldn't tell you this. My father would be furious, but you've earned some honesty from me, given everything." He hesitated. "The information that led to the Naples seizure, Dante wasn't the only source. Someone within my own family's organisation has been in contact with him for months. I don't know who yet, but whoever it is, they're still active, Sophia. Dante's exile didn't end this. It only removed one piece of a larger game." Sophia's stomach dropped. "You're certain? I intercepted a message 2 weeks ago, encrypted, sent to an account I later traced back to correspondence with Dante's known associates, dated well after his exile from Marco's organisation." Enzo's expression had gone grim, genuinely concerned now, rather than performative. Someone wants this partnership to fail badly enough that they're still working to sabotage it, even with Dante gone. I'd tell Marco myself, but given our history, I doubt he'd trust my information without independent verification. You, he'll believe. Sophia found Marco 20 minutes later, deep in conversation with Don Alessio near the fireplace, and the urgency in her expression must have been visible even across the room, because he excused himself immediately, crossing to her side with concern already sharpening his features. "What's wrong?" "We need to talk," Sophia said quietly, privately, now. They found privacy in a small stone chapel adjoining the main estate, centuries old, lit only by the moonlight filtering through narrow arched windows. Sophia relayed Enzo's warning in careful detail, watching Marco's expression shift from confusion to alarm, to a grim, calculating focus she'd come to recognize as the truest sign of danger. "He's certain the leak is still active?" "He intercepted a message 2 weeks ago, after Dante's exile." Sophia's hands twisted together anxiously. Someone inside the Moretti organisation has been communicating with Dante's associates, which means either Dante is still involved somehow, despite the exile, or he was never the primary source to begin with, Marco finished grimly. He was a piece, not the architect. Who would want this deal to fail badly enough to keep working against it even after Dante was removed? Marco was silent for a long moment, his mind clearly working through possibilities with the same ruthless calculation he applied to every threat. There are men in both our families who never wanted this partnership. Old Guard members who believe the Morettis and Ritchies should remain rivals, the way they were for 2 generations before my grandfather and Don Alessio's father brokered peace. A merger this significant threatens the power structure that's benefited those men for decades. So this isn't about you or about me. It's about someone trying to prevent the alliance itself. Which means, Marco said, his jaw tightening, that whoever's behind this has been playing a longer game than we realized, using Dante's resentment, using Enzo's carelessness at the club and the gala, using every crack they could find, building towards something bigger than a few sabotaged shipments. The chapel door creaked open before either of them could continue, and Vitale stepped inside, his expression grave. "Marco, there's something you need to see." They followed him to a private study within the estate that Don Alessio had made available for Marco's security team, where Vitale spread a series of intercepted communications across a table, the same messages Enzo had referenced, obtained through channels Vitale didn't elaborate on, though Sophia suspected they involved resources far less legal than anything documented in Ritchie Shipping's official records. The account communicating with Dante's known associates traces back to a shell identity, Vitale explained. But the pattern of activity, the timing, the specific knowledge of both families' internal operations, I believe this points to someone with deep access to both organizations. Not just the Morettis. Us too. "You think it's someone within my own organization?" Marco said flatly. "Beyond Dante." "I think," Vitale said carefully, "that Dante's resentment made him useful. But he wasn't sophisticated enough to orchestrate something this coordinated on his own. Someone guided him. Someone with the patience and resources for a longer campaign." Marco's eyes narrowed. Who had access to Dante during his time with the family? Who would have both the motive and the opportunity to manipulate him into becoming a pawn? Vitale's expression turned grim, and Sophia watched him hesitate, clearly reluctant to voice a suspicion he'd been carrying. "There's one name that fits every piece of this," he said finally. "Someone who's worked closely with both families for over a decade. Someone who handled the original brokering of peace between your grandfather and Don Alessio's father, and who has never fully recovered from watching that peace deal cost him influence he once held when the families were rivals." "Who?" Vitale's next word landed like a blade. "Cross." Sophia's mind raced back to the lawyer who'd sat in on that first tense meeting after the Naples seizure. Marco's own counsel. A man who'd handled the family's most delicate legal matters for years, present in nearly every conversation, privy to nearly every secret. "Cross has been my family's lawyer since before I took over the business," Marco said, his voice tight with disbelief and dawning horror. "He handled my father's affairs. He handled the original negotiations that ended the war between our families 30 years ago. And he lost significant standing when that war ended," Vitale said. "During the years your families were rivals, Cross served as an intermediary, a fixer, a man both sides needed and feared. Peace made him less essential, less powerful. I believe he spent years quietly working to reignite tensions he profited from, and Dante's resentment gave him the perfect instrument." Marco's expression had gone cold, terrifyingly still. The particular calm that Sophia now understood preceded his most dangerous decisions.
"Get him here," he said quietly. "Tonight. I want to look him in the eyes when I ask him the truth." "Marco," Sophia said carefully, "if he's been this careful for this long, he won't simply confess. He won't need to." Marco's pale eyes had gone glacial. "I'll know the truth the moment I see his face. I've spent my entire life reading men who think they're better liars than they actually are." Cross arrived at the estate 2 hours later, summoned under the pretense of finalizing paperwork for the signed agreement, unaware that Vitali's investigation had already unraveled the careful architecture of his betrayal. Sophia watched him enter the study where Marco waited, his expression carrying the same practiced neutrality she'd seen countless times in boardrooms, utterly unaware that this particular performance was about to be his last. "Marco." Cross's smile was warm, professional. "I understand congratulations are in order. The signing went smoothly, I hope?" "It did." Marco gestured to the chair across from his desk. "Sit. We need to discuss something important." Cross settled into the chair with the easy confidence of a man who had no reason to suspect danger, and Sophia understood, watching him, exactly how he'd managed to operate undetected for so long. The perfect mask of trustworthiness, honed over decades of navigating dangerous men who valued exactly the qualities he'd weaponized against them. "Tell me about the shell account," Marco said without preamble, "that's been communicating with Dante's associates for the past 2 weeks. The one that traces back to a shipping seizure in Naples, and a photographer hired to threaten the woman I love, and a pattern of sabotage that's been unfolding since long before I even knew Sophia's name." Cross's expression didn't shift, not visibly, but Sophia, who had spent months learning to watch hands instead of mouths, to read the truth beneath careful composure, noticed the almost imperceptible tightening of his fingers against the armrest. "I don't know what you're referring to." "I think you do." Marco's voice remained deceptively calm, though Sophia could feel the fury simmering beneath it, barely restrained. "You brokered the peace between my grandfather and Don Alessio's father 30 years ago. You built your entire reputation, your entire value to both families on being the indispensable man who understood how to navigate the war between us. And then that war ended, and you became just another lawyer. Just another employee, replaceable, no longer essential." "Marco, this is absurd. You manipulated my brother's resentment. You fed him just enough information, just enough encouragement to convince him that sabotaging the shipments, threatening Sophia, would somehow save this family from what you framed as my weakness. And when I exiled him, you didn't stop. You found another way in through the Moretti's own organization, because your real goal was never about my brother's ambition at all. It was about reigniting a rivalry that made you powerful again." Cross's mask finally cracked, something cold and calculating replacing the careful warmth he'd maintained for the entire conversation. "You have no proof of any of this." "I don't need proof," Marco said quietly. "I have your face, right now, confirming everything Vitale suspected." The room fell into a silence so absolute, Sophia could hear her own heartbeat. Cross's eyes darted briefly toward the door, calculating, and Vitale's hand moved subtly toward the weapon Sophia knew he carried beneath his jacket. 30 years, Cross said finally, his voice dropping into something bitter, resigned. 30 years I gave to this family and the Morettis both, navigating a war that made me essential, that made powerful men need me the way they needed air.
And your grandfather and Don Alessio's father decided in one afternoon to make peace and reduce me to a glorified paper pusher, handling contracts instead of shaping the destiny of two empires. His eyes hardened. I watched you inherit power you never had to fight for, Marco. I watched you take everything your grandfather built and everything I helped preserve, and I decided I would not simply fade into irrelevance while you enjoyed the empire I helped protect. So you tried to destroy it instead. I tried to reclaim what was taken from me. Cross's composure had fully abandoned him now, decades of buried resentment spilling out in a torrent. Your brother was easy to manipulate. His jealousy of you was obvious to anyone paying attention. The Moretti contact was harder, but every organization has men who resent the peace as much as I do. Men who remember when war made them powerful too. And Sophia? The black roses? The threat to a woman who had done nothing but her job? Cross's eyes flicked toward her, something almost apologetic beneath the coldness. I needed you distracted, emotionally compromised. A man in love makes mistakes. A man focused solely on business never would. I never intended actual harm to her, only enough fear to fracture your concentration. You threatened the woman I love to manipulate me into weakness, Marco said, his voice dropping to something Sophia had never heard before, a register of controlled, absolute fury that made the air in the room feel suddenly thin. You spent 30 years pretending loyalty while quietly working to destroy everything this family built, all because peace cost you the kind of power that only exists in war. He rose from his desk, and for a terrifying moment, Sophia feared he might do something irreversible, something that would forever change the man she loved into someone capable of violence in cold blood. Witnessed, remembered, carried forward into every future moment between them. Marco, she said quietly, rising to stand beside him. He's not worth what it would cost you to hurt him yourself. Marco's eyes found hers, and something in her steady gaze seemed to anchor him, pull him back from whatever precipice he'd been standing on. Betrayal, he said finally, his voice regaining its controlled register. Take him. He'll face the consequences the old way, through Don Alessio and myself jointly, as befits a betrayal against both families. But he doesn't leave this estate a free man, tonight or ever again. As Vitali escorted Cross from the room, the older man's composure fully collapsed, pleas and justifications spilling out that no one in the room had any interest in hearing. Marco turned to Sophia, his expression raw with the exhaustion of confronting yet another betrayal from someone he'd trusted for years. It's over, he said quietly, though the words carried more hope than certainty. The leak, the sabotage, all of it traces back to him. Are you certain there's no one else? Marco's jaw tightened, and for the first time since she'd known him, Sophia saw genuine uncertainty in his expression. The recognition that even a man as powerful and vigilant as he could never fully guarantee the absence of hidden enemies. No, he admitted, I'm not certain of anything anymore, except that I love you, and that I will spend the rest of my life making sure nothing like this ever threatens you again. Cross's fate was decided the following morning in a joint council between Marco and Don Alessio, conducted with the particular gravity of old-world justice that operated far outside any courtroom Sophia had ever known. She wasn't present for the details, though Marco's grim expression when he returned to their room afterward told her enough. Cross would not be seen in either family's business again, and the specifics of that permanent absence were details Marco clearly didn't intend to share. Don Alessio wants to formalize the alliance further, Marco told her that evening as they sat together on the terrace overlooking the darkening sea. He's suggested a symbolic gesture, a public announcement of our engagement timed to coincide with the finalized partnership. A wedding between the American and Calabrian branches of this world would send a message no one could misinterpret. That's a significant decision to make based on political convenience. It's not convenience. Marco's hand found hers, his thumb tracing gentle patterns against her palm. I would marry you regardless of what message it sends to anyone else. The timing simply happens to align with what I already wanted. Sophia studied his face in the fading light, searching for any trace of calculation beneath the sincerity, and found none. You're certain? After everything, Dante's betrayal, Cross's manipulation, the danger that's followed us since the beginning, you still want this life? With everything it costs? I've spent my entire life being certain about business, about power, about the calculations that keep an empire running. His pale eyes held hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. You are the only thing I've ever been certain about that has nothing to do with any of that. Not power, not legacy, just you. He rose from his chair and knelt before her, the formality of the gesture at odds with the raw vulnerability in his expression, and produced a small velvet box that he must have carried since New York, patient, waiting for the right moment. Sophia Marchetti, he said, his voice rougher than she'd ever heard it. You walked into my life speaking a language I thought no one alive still understood. And you understood not just my words, but everything beneath them, every fear, every wound, every part of myself I'd spent 38 years hiding from the world. I have built an empire on power and calculation and control. I want to build the rest of my life on something entirely different. I want to build it on you. Tears blurred her vision as he opened the box, revealing a ring that was, despite the wealth surrounding them, understated and elegant. A single emerald surrounded by small diamonds, the colour, she realised with a fresh wave of emotion, matching the dress she'd worn the night at the Onyx Room when he'd first admitted the depth of what he felt for her. Marry me, Marco said. Not because it serves an alliance, or protects a business, or sends a message to anyone watching. Marry me because I cannot imagine a version of my life that doesn't include you in every part of it. Yes, Sophia whispered, and the word had barely left her mouth before he'd risen and pulled her into a kiss that spoke of every fear conquered, every wall dismantled, every terrifying vulnerability finally, fully embraced. The engagement was announced formally the following week, first to both families, and then, with careful diplomatic staging, to the broader circles of power that orbited both the Riches and Morettis. The reaction, for the most part, was celebratory, a symbolic union that promised stability after months of sabotage and suspicion, a story the press kept carefully at arm's length from the true nature of either family's business, could spin into something romantic and inspiring. But not everyone celebrated. Enzo Moretti, despite his earlier apology and genuine assistance in uncovering Cross's betrayal, seemed to withdraw in the weeks following the announcement, his warmth towards Sophia cooling into something more guarded, more distant. Are you all right? she asked him one evening, finding him alone on the estate's terrace, staring out at the same sea view that had witnessed Marco's proposal days earlier. "I'm fine." His smile was thin, unconvincing. "Congratulations, by the way. I don't think I said that properly." "You don't seem fine." Enzo was quiet for a long moment, and when he finally spoke, something raw and unguarded had crept into his usually careful composure. "I've spent my whole life being told I'd inherit power, influence, everything my father built. And watching you and Richie, watching what real partnership looks like, what it means to actually be understood by someone rather than simply obeyed or feared, I've started to wonder if I've ever actually wanted any of what I was raised to want." "That's a significant realization." "It's an inconvenient one," he corrected, with a self-deprecating laugh that held real pain beneath it. "My father expects me to marry strategically, the way this alliance was nearly built. A business transaction disguised as romance. Watching you and Marco has made that prospect feel unbearable in a way it never did before." Sophia felt an unexpected wave of sympathy for the man who had once threatened her composure with nothing more than proprietary charm. "For what it's worth, Enzo, you helped save this alliance and possibly both our lives when you brought that information to me. That's not nothing. That's not a man destined only for the strategic marriage his father wants for him." Enzo's smile, when it came, was genuine for the first time since she'd known him. "Maybe not. Or maybe I just needed something to prove to myself I wasn't entirely the man my father raised me to be." He glanced at her, something almost fond in his expression now, stripped of its earlier predatory edge. "Take care of him, Sophia. I mean that. Whatever else I've been in this story, I've never doubted that Ricci actually loves you. And God knows, this world doesn't offer that particular mercy very often." They returned to New York 3 weeks later, the engagement settled, the partnership stabilized, and for a fleeting stretch of months, life inside the fortress of the Tribeca penthouse felt almost peaceful. Wedding preparations occupied much of Sophia's time, a ceremony planned for the following spring, small by the standards of families this powerful, but lavish by any ordinary measure, blending Calabrian tradition with the particular grandeur Marco's world demanded. Sophia had begun, cautiously, to believe the worst danger had passed. Cross was gone. Dante remained exiled, reportedly living quietly in Miami, though Vitale kept a discreet watch on him regardless. The port contracts flowed smoothly, the alliance between the Riccis and Morettis solidifying into something that finally resembled genuine partnership rather than uneasy truce. It was a Tuesday evening in late November when the fragile peace shattered. Sophia had stayed late at the office, finalizing translation work for an upcoming meeting, when Renata appeared in her doorway with an expression that immediately set Sophia's nerves on edge. "There's someone here to see you," Renata said. "She says she's your aunt, says it's urgent, about your mother." Sophia's stomach dropped. Her mother, in remission for nearly a year, had been declining slightly in recent weeks, according to her most recent checkup, though nothing that had seemed cause for alarm. "My aunt? I don't have an aunt in New York." Renata's frown deepened. "She's downstairs, insisting on speaking with you directly." Sophia's instincts screamed warning even before she reached the lobby, and when she saw the woman waiting there, unfamiliar, sharp-eyed, carrying herself with a coiled tension that didn't match the grieving relative she claimed to be, Every alarm bell she'd learned to trust over the past months rang at once. "Ms. Marchetti," the woman said, her accent carrying traces of Calabrian dialect beneath careful English. "I need a moment of your time, privately." "I don't know you." "No, but you'll want to hear what I have to say." The woman's eyes flicked toward the security guards stationed near the entrance, a subtle warning. "Alone, or the message I'm about to deliver becomes significantly less private than either of us would prefer." Against every instinct telling her to summon security immediately, Sophia found herself following the woman to a quiet corner of the lobby, curiosity and dread warring in equal measure. "What is this about?" "Your father," the woman said, and the words landed like a physical blow. "Giovanni Marchetti. You believe he died of a heart attack when you were 4 years old. That's the story your mother told you, isn't it? The story she's told everyone for 24 years. Sophia's blood ran cold. "How do you know my father's name?" "Because I knew him." The woman's expression carried something between grief and satisfaction, an unsettling combination that made Sophia's skin crawl. "Your father wasn't an insurance salesman who died of heart failure, Ms. Marchetti. He was a soldier in the Calabrian resistance, against families exactly like the one you're about to marry into. He was killed, executed to be precise, on the order of Alessio Moretti's father, for refusing to cooperate with an extortion scheme targeting small shipping operations along the coast." "That's not possible. My mother would have—" "Your mother has spent 24 years protecting you from a truth that would have made this engagement, this entire relationship with Marco Ricci, unbearable." The woman's eyes held something that looked almost like pity. "The Riccis and Morettis brokered peace 30 years ago, Ms. Marchetti, ending a war that claimed dozens of lives, including your father's. You're not just marrying into a dangerous family. You're marrying into the very organization responsible for making you an orphan." Sophia's mind reeled, the careful architecture of her understanding of her own history collapsing under the weight of this revelation. She wanted, desperately, to dismiss the woman as a liar, a manipulator sent by some enemy determined to fracture her relationship with Marco the way Cross had once tried and failed. "Why are you telling me this, now, after all this time?" "Because you deserve the truth before you marry the man whose family's peace was built on your father's blood." The woman's expression hardened. "And because there are still those of us who remember what the Morettis and Riccis truly are, beneath the legitimate businesses and careful diplomacy. You've been shown only the version of these men that suits their current purposes. I'm showing you the version history remembers." She pressed a worn photograph into Sophia's trembling hands before turning to leave. An old photograph of a young man Sophia had never seen, standing beside a much younger version of her own mother, both of them smiling in a way that suggested a life entirely different from the one Sophia had grown up believing was her family's only history. "Ask your mother," the woman said, pausing at the door. "Ask her about Giovanni, about what really happened in 1998, in the hills above Reggio, before your family fled to America to escape a war neither Ricci nor Moretti has ever fully accounted for." She disappeared into the New York night before Sophia could formulate another question, leaving her standing alone in the lobby with a photograph that threatened to unravel everything she thought she knew about her own life and about the man she had promised to marry. Sophia didn't tell Marco immediately. She spent that night awake in their bed, the photograph hidden in her purse like a live coal, watching him sleep beside her, with an expression she couldn't quite name. Love, still, undeniable and constant, but shadowed now by a fear she hadn't anticipated needing to feel toward him. The following morning, she called her mother. "Mama," she said, her voice carefully controlled, despite the storm raging beneath her composure. "I need to ask you something about Papa." The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Sophia understood with sickening certainty that whatever the woman in the lobby had told her carried at least some grain of truth. "Where did this question come from?" her mother finally asked, her voice tight with an old, careful wariness Sophia had never noticed before, had never had reason to notice in 24 years of accepting the story she'd been given as simple, uncomplicated fact. "A woman approached me last night. She said Papa wasn't an insurance salesman. She said he died in 1998, in the hills above Reggio, killed by the Moretti family for refusing to cooperate with an extortion scheme." Her mother's breath caught audibly across the line, and when she finally spoke, her voice had broken into something raw, decades of carefully maintained composure finally cracking. "I always feared this day would come, especially now, with who you're marrying." "So it's true?" "Yes." The word landed like a confession, 24 years in the making. "Your father worked with a small resistance network in Calabria. Families who refused to pay protection money to the organizations that controlled the coastal shipping routes. The Morettis were the dominant family in that region at the time. When your father organized other shipping operators to resist their extortion, Alessio Moretti's father ordered him killed as an example to anyone else who might consider defiance." Sophia's hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the phone. "And the Ritchies? Were they involved?" "Not directly, not then. Your father's death predates the current alliance between the two families by years. But the Ritchie family and the Moretti family have always operated within the same world, the same understanding of power and consequence. I fled to America not just to escape the Morettis specifically, but to escape an entire system that considered your father's life an acceptable price for maintaining control." Her mother's voice broke entirely now, tears audible even through the phone. "I never told you because I wanted you to have a life untouched by that world, Sophia. And now you're marrying directly into it, and I don't know how to reconcile the fear I've carried for 24 years with the joy I've watched in your voice every time you talk about this man." Sophia sat in stunned silence for a long moment, the full weight of her mother's sacrifice, her careful, decades-long protection, settling over her like a shroud. "Why didn't you ever try to stop me from taking this job, from getting close to Marco?" "Because by the time I understood who you were working for, you were already in love with him. I could see it in your voice, Sophia, long before you ever said the words aloud. And I have spent my entire adult life being told what's best for me by men with power. I refused to be the person who told my own daughter she couldn't choose her own life, even knowing the risks." After the call ended, Sophia sat motionless for nearly an hour. The photograph of her young father spread on the table before her, warring instincts pulling her in opposite directions. Every rational part of her understood that Marco himself bore no direct responsibility for a crime committed by the Moretti family before he'd even inherited leadership of his own organization. But the emotional truth was messier, more visceral. She was preparing to marry into an alliance with the very family whose actions had orphaned her. had shaped her mother's entire adult life around fear and secrecy. She found Marco that evening in his study, and the moment he saw her face, his own expression shifted immediately into alarm. "What's wrong?" Sophia set the photograph on his desk without a word, watching his face as he studied the image, confusion giving way slowly to a dawning, horrified understanding as she recounted in careful detail everything the mysterious woman had told her, everything her mother had subsequently confirmed. When she finished, Marco was silent for a long, agonized moment, his pale eyes carrying an expression of genuine anguish she'd rarely seen from him. "I didn't know," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "Sophia, I swear to you, I had no knowledge of your father, of what happened in 1998. I was a child when this occurred." "I believe you." And she did, with a certainty that surprised her, even amid the chaos of the revelation. "But that doesn't change the fact that I'm about to marry into the family responsible for my father's death. That doesn't change what my mother has carried for 24 years alone to protect me from exactly this moment. What do you want to do?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications neither of them was fully prepared to address. Sophia looked at the man she loved, a man who had dismantled his own brother's ambitions to protect her, who had confronted his family's oldest betrayal to keep her safe, who had knelt before her on a Calabrian terrace and offered her a future built on something more honest than power, and felt her heart fracture along a line she hadn't known existed until the previous night. "I don't know," she admitted, tears finally spilling over. "I love you, Marco. That hasn't changed. But I need to understand the truth of what happened to my father fully before I can decide what kind of future I'm actually walking into." Marco spent the following 3 days in a state of controlled, methodical fury, dispatching Vitale to uncover every available record of the 1998 killings in the hills above Reggio, determined to give Sophia the complete truth, regardless of what it might cost his own family's alliance with the Morettis. What emerged was more complicated than either the mysterious woman's account or Sophia's mother's memory had suggested. Giovanni Marchetti was killed in 1998, Vitali confirmed, spreading a series of documents across Marco's desk during a private meeting that included Sophia for the first time in what had become an increasingly tense investigation. But the order didn't come from Alessio Moretti's father directly. It came from a lieutenant acting without full authorization, a man named Paolo Greco, who was executed himself 2 years later when Alessio's father discovered the unsanctioned killing had nearly triggered a war with the resistance network your father belonged to. Sophia's breath caught. "He was executed for killing my father?" Not entirely for that reason, but it factored into the decision. Alessio's father valued stability over unnecessary violence. Greco's killing of Giovanni Marchetti was reckless, threatening to destabilize territory the Morettis had worked years to secure peacefully. When Greco compounded his error with additional unsanctioned violence against other resistance members, Alessio's father had him eliminated as punishment and as a message to the rest of the organization. Vitali's expression was grave. "This doesn't excuse what happened to your father, Sophia, but it complicates the narrative you were given. Alessio Moretti's father didn't order your father's death as calculated extortion enforcement. It was an unauthorized act by a subordinate who was ultimately punished for it." That's a distinction that means very little to a 4-year-old girl who grew up without her father, Sophia said, her voice tight with grief that had waited 24 years to fully surface. "I know," Marco said quietly, moving to stand beside her, though he made no move to touch her, seemingly aware that the gesture might not be welcome, given everything unravelling between them. "And I won't pretend the distinction erases your loss, or your mother's fear, or the 2 decades she spent protecting you from a truth this painful. But I need you to understand something else, Sophia. Something that might matter, given the decision you're facing." "What?" "Don Alessio doesn't know the woman who approached you was connected to this history. I intend to find out who she is and why she chose now, specifically, to reveal a 24-year-old secret timed precisely to fracture our engagement." His jaw tightened. "This feels orchestrated, Sophia. Someone wants you to walk away from me, and they found the most devastating possible truth to use as a weapon." The realization settled over Sophia with cold clarity. The timing, so precisely calibrated to land after the engagement announcement, after months of stability, after Cross's exposure and Dante's exile, had presumably eliminated every remaining threat to their relationship. "You think someone orchestrated this? That the woman who approached me wasn't simply a truth-teller motivated by conscience, but a weapon deployed by someone still working against us?" "I think it's possible. I also think it doesn't change the fundamental truth of what happened to your father, or the pain that truth causes you, regardless of who chose to reveal it and why." Marco's voice softened. "I won't manipulate you into staying by focusing only on the conspiracy angle, Sophia. Your grief is real. Your father's death is real. Whatever timing was used to weaponize that truth against us, the truth itself deserves your full reckoning, not a rushed dismissal because it happens to be politically inconvenient for our engagement." Sophia felt fresh tears gathering, moved, despite everything, by his refusal to minimize her pain, even when doing so might have served his own interests. "Who would want to destroy this engagement badly enough to weaponize my father's death?" Vitale and Marco exchanged a grim look before Marco finally spoke. "I have a theory, though I want more evidence before I act on it. Dante's exile removed him from direct access to family business, but it didn't remove his resentment or his knowledge of vulnerabilities within both organizations. If he's found a way to reconnect with remnants of Cross's old network, you think Dante is behind this?" "I think it's possible. He's trying one final time to destroy what he couldn't destroy through sabotage or intimidation." Marco's expression had gone hard, cold with the particular fury reserved for family betrayal. "I'll know within days. Vitale is already tracing the woman who approached you, and I suspect that trail will lead somewhere uncomfortably familiar." 3 days later, Vitale's investigation confirmed exactly what Marco had suspected. The woman who'd approached Sophia in the lobby was identified as a former associate of Cross's, someone who'd maintained contact with Dante during his exile in Miami, recruited specifically for this singular purpose, delivering a devastating truth at the precise moment calculated to cause maximum damage to an engagement that represented everything Dante had failed to prevent through more direct means. He knew he couldn't stop the alliance through sabotage, Marco said grimly, once the full picture had emerged. So he found the one truth capable of making you question whether you could ever truly belong in this family, regardless of how much you loved me. Sophia sat in stunned silence, processing the layered betrayal. Not just her father's death, real and devastating regardless of its origins, but the calculated cruelty of a man who had weaponized her deepest grief for his own vendetta against his brother. What happens to Dante now? Marco's expression carried a weight Sophia hadn't seen from him before, the particular exhaustion of a man forced yet again to reckon with his own family's capacity for betrayal. I don't know yet, but I promise you this, Sophia. Regardless of what happens to my brother, the truth about your father remains real and deserves to be honoured, not dismissed simply because of who chose to weaponize it against us. If you need time, if you need to grieve, if you need to decide whether you can build a future with a family connected, however indirectly, to the man who killed your father, I will give you whatever space you need. I love you enough to let you make that choice freely, even if the answer terrifies me. Sophia took 2 weeks. She moved temporarily into a small hotel in the city, needing distance not from Marco specifically, but from the gravitational pull of his presence, his certainty, his overwhelming capacity to make every fear feel smaller simply by existing beside her. She needed to sit with her grief alone, to finally properly mourn a father she'd never truly known, to have the conversation with her mother that 2 decades of careful protection had postponed. She flew to visit her mother in Florida, where Elena Marchetti had retired after selling the Queen's apartment where Sophia had grown up, and the two of them sat together on her mother's small balcony overlooking the Gulf, finally speaking openly about a history that had shaped both their lives in ways Sophia was only beginning to fully understand. "He was a good man," her mother said, tears falling freely as she spoke of Giovanni for the first time in years. Brave, maybe too brave. He believed the resistance network could actually change something, could push back against families who'd controlled that coastline for generations. I begged him to stop, Sophia. I told him we had a daughter who needed her father more than the coast needed another hero. Her voice broke. He didn't listen. And I've spent 24 years both furious at him for that choice and desperately proud of him for making it. Do you blame the Morettis? Even knowing the man who ordered it was punished for acting without authorization. Her mother considered the question for a long moment, staring out at the darkening water. I blame the entire world that made his death feel necessary to someone, whether authorized or not. I don't know if I can separate the Morettis as an organization from the specific man who pulled the trigger, even 24 years later. But I also know that world is complicated, Sophia, more complicated than simple villains and victims. Alessio Moretti's father punished the man who killed your father. That's not justice. Not really. Not enough to undo what was lost. But it's not nothing either. What do you think I should do about Marco? Her mother reached over, taking Sophia's hand with the same gentle strength she remembered from childhood, from years of navigating grief and struggle, without ever once letting Sophia see how heavy that weight truly was. I can't make that choice for you. I spent 24 years protecting you from a truth I hoped you'd never have to reckon with. And now that you have, I refuse to compound that by telling you how to feel about the man you love. Her eyes, so like Sophia's own, held a fierce, protective intensity. But I will tell you this. I watched you talk about him before any of this came to light, Sophia. I heard something in your voice I never heard when you spoke about anyone else, ever. If that man makes you feel safe, seen and loved the way you deserve, truly deserve, not the compromised version most women in that world are offered, then don't let a truth about the past that he had no part in creating destroy a future he's clearly fighting to build with you. Sophia returned to New York 4 days later, her grief still raw but no longer paralyzing, having finally allowed herself to properly mourn a father whose death had shaped her entire life without her ever fully understanding why. She hadn't yet decided what her return meant for her future with Marco, but she understood, driving back toward the city, that she needed to see him, not to deliver a final verdict, but to understand fully and honestly whether the love between them could hold the weight of everything that had been revealed. She found him not in the penthouse, but in his office, working late despite the hour, his expression carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent 2 weeks uncertain whether the woman he loved would ever return. Sophia. Her name left his mouth like a prayer, relief and fear warring across his features as he rose from his desk. I needed time, she said quietly, to grieve, to understand what my father's death actually means, separate from the family you belong to, separate from what happened between our families before either of us was born. And what did you decide? Sophia crossed the room slowly, studying his face. The same face that had once terrified her with its cold composure, that had since revealed layer after layer of vulnerability, tenderness, fierce protectiveness she'd never expected to find beneath the granite exterior of a man the world called dangerous. I decided that my father's death is a tragedy I will carry for the rest of my life, regardless of what I choose about us, she said. I decided that Don Alessio's father made a choice to punish the man responsible, which doesn't erase what was lost, but does mean something about the kind of justice, however imperfect, that exists even within this dangerous world. And I decided... Her voice broke, emotion finally overwhelming the careful composure she'd maintained throughout the conversation. That the man standing in front of me had nothing to do with any of it, and has spent every day since I met him proving, again and again, that he would burn his own family, his own empire, everything he's built, to protect me. I can't let a grief that predates both of us destroy a love that's become the truest thing in my entire life. Marco crossed the remaining distance between them in 3 strides, pulling her into his arms with a desperation that spoke of 2 weeks of uncertainty finally breaking. I love you, he murmured against her hair. I will spend every day making sure you never regret choosing to stay. I know. Sophia pulled back to look at him, tears streaming freely now, though her expression carried something steadier than the grief that had driven her away 2 weeks earlier. There's one more thing I need, though, before I can fully move forward. Anything. I need to meet Don Alessio again. Not as your fiancé, not as an interpreter, as Giovanni Marchetti's daughter. I need him to know what his organization's history cost me, even indirectly, even through a subordinate's unauthorized violence. I need that acknowledgement before I can walk into this family fully at peace with everything it's cost. Marco studied her for a long moment, something like profound respect moving through his expression. I'll arrange it, he said. Whatever you need, Sophia. I meant what I said in Calabria. I want all of you, including the parts of your history that predate anything either of us chose. The meeting with Don Alessio took place 3 weeks later, in the same estate overlooking the Ionian Sea, where Sophia had first learned to navigate the old dialect's careful diplomacies, where Marco had first defended her against his own family's suspicion, where the deepest layers of this dangerous world had slowly, painfully revealed themselves to her over the past year. Don Alessio received her alone, per Sophia's request, in the same study where the original signing ceremony documents had been finalized months earlier. He looked older somehow, the weight of what she was about to share visible in his posture, even before she spoke. "Marco told me why you wished to speak with me," he said quietly, in the old dialect, a gesture of respect she understood and appreciated. "Giovanni Marchetti's daughter. I confess, I did not make that connection when we first met, though perhaps I should have. Marchetti is not an uncommon name, but the resistance network your father belonged to was well known to my family, even if the specific tragedy of his death occurred through Greco's unauthorized recklessness rather than my father's direct order. I know the history now. I know Greco was punished. I know my father's death wasn't calculated extortion enforcement, but an act of violence by a man who exceeded his authority." Sophia's voice remained steady, despite the emotion coursing beneath it. "But I need you to understand what that death cost, regardless of authorization. My mother fled an entire country, an entire life, to protect me from a world that made my father's murder feel inevitable to someone, sanctioned or not. I grew up without a father because a man connected to your organization decided his life was worth less than maintaining control over a stretch of coastline." Don Alessio was silent for a long moment, his weathered face carrying an expression of genuine, unguarded grief. "I was 23 when Greco killed your father, already deeply involved in my own father's business, already understanding the particular brutality this world sometimes demanded, even from men who preferred peace to violence. I remember when Greco was executed for his recklessness. I remember believing at the time that justice had been served." His eyes met hers, ancient sorrow visible in their depths. "I understand now, hearing you speak of your mother's fear, your own childhood shaped by absence, that whatever justice my father delivered to Greco did nothing to restore what your family actually lost. I am sorry, Sophia. Not as a diplomatic gesture toward my son's ally's fiancée, but as a man who has spent decades in this world, understanding, more with each passing year, how little our particular forms of justice actually heal the wounds we cause." Sophia hadn't expected the apology to move her as deeply as it did, hadn't expected the old Don's grief to feel genuine rather than performative, hadn't expected this conversation to offer any measure of the closure she'd hoped for, without fully believing possible. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for telling me the truth, for not pretending the pain doesn't matter, simply because it happened before either of us had power to change it." "You are marrying into this family," Don Alessio said, "and this family carries histories heavier than any of us would choose if we could unmake the past. I hope you will find, despite everything, that the future Marco is building with you is worth the weight of that history. I have watched that boy since he was a child, Sophia. I have never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. Whatever peace exists between our families, whatever alliance we've built through business and politics, I believe the love between you and Marco is the truest peace either of our families has achieved in 3 generations. The wedding took place the following spring, in the hills above Gerace, beneath a sky so achingly blue it seemed designed specifically for the occasion. Sophia's mother stood beside her, finally at peace with a truth long buried, watching her daughter marry into a world she'd once fled, with nothing but fear and a 4-year-old child clutched against her chest. Marco waited at the altar in the same stillness that had first captured Sophia's attention in that Manhattan hallway nearly a year earlier. Though the coldness she'd once perceived in his pale eyes had long since transformed into something entirely different, a fierce, unwavering warmth reserved solely for her, visible now to everyone who witnessed the ceremony. "You once told me," Marco said, during vows spoken partly in English, partly in the old Calabrian dialect that had brought them together, "that you weren't just translating my words, but perceiving the truth beneath them. I want you to know that I have spent this entire year learning to do the same for you, to see not just what you say, but everything you carry beneath it, your grief, your strength, your fierce, unshakable capacity to face down danger without ever losing the tenderness that makes you who you are." His pale eyes, glassy with emotion he no longer bothered concealing, held hers with absolute devotion. "I promise to spend the rest of my life being worthy of that understanding. I promise that whatever this world requires of us, whatever danger finds its way to our door, you will never again face it without me standing exactly where I belong, beside you, protecting you, loving you with everything I am." Sophia's own vows, delivered through tears she made no effort to hide, spoke of a girl who'd grown up believing love and safety were separate, incompatible concepts, particularly within a world defined by power and danger, and of the man who had taught her, through fierce protectiveness and unguarded vulnerability alike, that the two could coexist after all. "I came into your life to translate your words," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled guests, across Vitale's proud smile, across Enzo Moretti's genuine happiness, across her mother's tearful pride, across Don Alessio's weathered, satisfied nod. "But somewhere along the way, you taught me a different kind of language, one built not on words at all, but on the fierce, unwavering certainty of a man who chooses every single day to protect what he loves, rather than fear the vulnerability that love requires. I will spend the rest of my life speaking that language beside you, Marco Ricci, not as your interpreter, as your wife, as the woman who finally, truly understands you, and who is understood, in return, more completely than she ever believed possible." As the sun set over the hills of Calabria, painting the ancient stones in gold and amber light, Marco Ricci kissed his wife with the same desperate reverence he'd shown her from the very beginning. A man who had once believed love was a liability his father had warned him against, now standing transformed into the truest version of himself, precisely because he'd finally allowed himself to be known completely by the one person capable of understanding every word he'd ever spoken and every silence beneath them. The danger that had shadowed their courtship, Dante's betrayal, Cross's manipulation, the weaponized grief of a father's long-buried death, had tested them in ways neither had anticipated when Sophia first walked through those black lacquered doors nearly a year earlier. But standing together now, surrounded by two families finally united not merely through business, but through genuine understanding. Sophia understood that every trial had led them here, to this golden evening, to a love strong enough to hold the weight of an entire dangerous world and emerge, against every reasonable expectation, unbroken. Somewhere in the crowd, Vitale raised a glass in silent tribute to the two people who had, against every rule this world had ever taught him, found something rarer than power, rarer than peace between warring families, rarer than anything he'd witnessed in 22 years of service. They had found each other, fully known and fully loved, in a world that rarely permitted either. And for Sofia Marchetti, once an interpreter hired to translate a dangerous man's words, now his wife, understanding not just his language, but his heart, that was a rarer, more precious victory than any empire could ever provide.